Yeah, morning, grade tens. I was thinking about your human rights and freedoms topic, and I'm going to be chatting with Jess in a few minutes because she's coming down here in a spare in our lesson. So I thought I've been thinking about it over the weekend. I was thinking about the 1948, the human rights Universal Declaration and some of the features and what it stood for, and where it's evolved over the past 60, 70 years. Now, it's more of a ramble this than anything focused upon your particular series of assessments, but obviously you're gonna about to come in when we come back next week to start thinking about the issue of Rwanda and the Hotel Rwanda and the crisis that took place there in the 1990s, and why the UN, or without spoiler alert, failed, right? Yeah, failed. Or the world community failed. But I was thinking, in 1948, the Human Rights Declaration, the Universal Declaration, is set in stone without really any means of enforcing any of the ideas that are in this declaration. So you've gone through the declaration, there's no cruel, inhumane punishments, and the right to work and all that business, which is brilliant, and we love them all, but, you know, I don't know if we can actually make these things happen. So remember, to put a bit of context onto this, the Nazis have just killed 6 million Jews for being Jews, nothing else. That's the reason they've killed them. So their lives have been ended because those people didn't fit into a Nazi vision for what they perceived Germany or the world should reflect. So by 1948, the powers that be at the United Nations, which has been set up to try to make sure peace is maintained, decide that addressing people's human rights is a way of making good on the failings of the past. And they come out with all of these points, which we've got, or you've looked at and thought about. And then I was thinking that by the 1960s, when you've been looking at last week, African American civil rights, and this week is Indigenous civil and land rights in this country. Now, obviously, black people in America were persecuted, did not get equality based solely upon the colour of their skin. Indigenous people in this country did not have the right to be classified as Australians until the result of the referendum in 67, he says, thinking about it. That until that time they couldn't own land and they couldn't be recognised as Australians. Black people back in America, under the protest of Martin Luther King and the more radical protests of people like Malcolm X, what you're experiencing there is a massive proportion of Americans fitting into that African American, Black American community compared to Indigenous Australians, which is a much lower percentage of the population. So obviously the African American civil rights movement is far bigger in terms of its perceived importance globally than the Indigenous civil rights movement and land rights movement here. That's not to say the movement here is any less important. It's not. It's just as important, because ultimately, if nothing else, the United Nations human rights movement treats every single human being in the world as an equally important person as anybody else. So that, if nothing else, is your kind of yardstick, which brings me to the movement in Africa. When we study or when you watch Hotel Rwanda and we study the actions or inactions of the United Nations, and how, to be frank and honest, when bad things happen in Africa and to African people, less people care. When human rights violations or atrocities are happening in a Western country, be it Australia, be it America, be it Britain, be it anywhere, when it's happening in a Western country, the media is able to shine a light on that abuse and let everybody know that these things are wrong and these things are happening. So change can eventuate, change can happen. When it's going on in Africa, there's a great deal, sadly, of disinterest. People don't care sufficiently for those people. It means very, very little. There's nothing at stake. There's no money at stake. There's no trade at stake. So it's only later when we see, I don't know, things like blood diamonds coming out of Africa where people start asking questions about the origins of their diamonds, where people start to think about the choices that they make, and ultimately, if nothing else, what the United Nations Declaration does over time, it makes people aware of their rights and their responsibilities, and where in the world those rights and responsibilities are failing. So now, when we think of the biggest issues facing the world or facing communities in the world, we are aware of issues like gay rights in Russia. For example, years ago, it wouldn't have been on anybody's agenda, or the right to political protest in the Middle East and that kind of thing. That those things are valued in almost every other country of the world. The internet and global connectedness has made the world a smaller place, and because of that making the world a smaller place, people who lack a voice, people who lack a sense of identity, can make their voice heard a little bit more. Look, any idiot nowadays can put something on YouTube. Where are you watching this? Think about that. That those connections to being able to see what people's experiences are, what their rights are, and how their rights are being violated, it's really, really easy and straightforward to see that, and we can all have an opinion on our rights and the violations of other people's rights all around the world. So I mentioned gay rights a few minutes ago, that now, and I've just looked on the internet, Googled it, that the LGBTQIA is a movement. I'd heard of the LGBT, but I didn't know about the QIAs. They've come on board now, and they've got human rights, and people are aware of that. So where does all of this end? That it started out with the Jews, and the United Nations Declaration was a response to the failure of the world community to protect Jewish people in the Holocaust, and it's become, I guess, an opportunity for any marginalized group to have their say and feel that their rights are just as important as any other people's rights, and that's where the UN has moved. Whether it does enough is a question for another day, but I'm up to almost 9 minutes now, and you've heard me prattling on. Hopefully, if nothing else, it's made you think a little bit about the role of the UN, and think a little bit about the way that people's rights have improved over time, but still there are people who feel that they are either marginalized or on the edge of society, or their rights aren't being met or heard. And we're in a position now to possibly shine a light, or at least talk about whether those people's rights are genuinely worth considering, or whether they should maybe go, oh, actually, I'm having a bit of a moan. All right, have a think about that. All the best. See you later.